Oh, hi, folks. Hi. Getting ready for a seminar in ethical theory lecture today. I hope all of you guys are doing well. Um, Today, I want to, respond to various comments and questions I've received about C.L. Stevens' emotive theory of moral discourse. That will take up maybe the first 15 minutes or 20 minutes of the lecture today. And then I want to move on to Alasdair MacIntyre, the first two chapters of After Virtue, which you should have read for today. Also, you should have looked at my outline. I'll be making a good bit of reference to my outline. Hopefully, you can, be watching the. Hopefully, you can be watching the lecture in one window on your computer, and then have the outline available on another window, because I will make reference to it. Before I get into responding to some of your comments and questions regarding Stevenson's emotive theory of ethics, let me talk about what's coming up. For Monday, April 6th, that class meeting will go live on Zoom at 2 o'clock. What I'll do is I'll start a meeting at 2, and then I'll invite each of you to the meeting. You should go to your email at about 2 o'clock on Monday. Go into your email. You should get an invitation from me to join my meeting, and then we'll have class for. I don't think our class should take more than an hour, from 2 to 3 on Monday, and that's how we'll proceed for the rest of the semester. It seems like with a small class with just 5 students, we ought to be able to have fairly decent live meetings on Zoom, and then we can just discuss the theories and arguments that way. Also for Monday, keep in mind, first of all, that you guys have papers due, 4 to 5 page exegetical papers on Aristotelian ethics. That assignment's been out for a while. Just send those as attachments to an email to me. Get them to me by 5 o'clock on Monday. Also, for Monday, you should read J.L. Mackie, The Subjectivity of Value. And I will talk about J.L. Mackie's essay, The Subjectivity of Value, on Monday. Also on Monday, each one of you should do a short assignment explaining some aspect of MacIntyre's After Virtue chapters 1 and 2, raising, I'll want you to explain some aspect of MacIntyre's work and then raise a question or a problem concerning what he says. Those assignments are going to be due, those short assignments will be due on Monday at 11 a.m. I want them by 11 a.m. so that I can look at your short assignments and think about them some before we meet live at 2 o'clock on Zoom. So that's some things coming up. I'll also be sending you an outline on J.L. Mackie's work, which you should get. I don't know, maybe I'll send that Monday morning, or maybe I'll send it Friday or Saturday or Sunday. But anyway, you will get an outline from me regarding J.L. Mackie's work before we have that class meeting on Monday. All right, let's talk about some of the stuff that you guys sent in. Most of you did send in a short assignment. Maybe I'll start by talking about something that Luke Vanderschaft says in his short assignment. I want to quote 1.5 paragraphs from Vanderschaft and then respond. So here's the quote from Vanderschaft. And again, right, these are all critical responses to C.L. Stevenson's emotive theory of the meaning of moral language and moral discourse. Vanderschaft writes, I take significant issue with the first criteria, moral disagreement. Stevenson points out that a moral account must allow for moral disagreement. The underlying argument for this point is that there are moral disagreements in the world, so the theory presented must allow for moral disagreements. For example, Stevenson points to Hobbes' theory that if someone says X is good, all they are saying is I desire X. So if two people genuinely desire opposite things, they're not actually in disagreement, they merely have different desires. Vanderschaft continues, however, this is counterintuitive to the very nature of a moral theory. Although I agree that the theory presented by Hobbes is highly flawed, This criterion is a complete misinterpretation of the desire for a moral theory. People seek a moral theory because the process of determining what the moral act in any given situation is complicated and treacherous. There naturally exists disagreement when it comes to morality and the goodness of action. We look to moral theories not to merely explain what is going on and what the meaning of a statement is, but to help guide our decision-making process to do what is right. So a moral theory that merely describes the state of nature and argues that the theory should allow for disagreement is useless. Every person with a functioning brain can observe that there is moral disagreement. We don't need a philosopher to tell us that and explain why that is the case. It should instead tell us who is right when a moral disagreement arises, so that we know what the proper action is and what it is right to do in a given moral dilemma. Otherwise, what use is the theory? End quote from Luc van der Schaaf. Luke, that's certainly a spirited response to Stevenson, but I just want to point out that I think that the issue you raise here with Stevenson, I do think it's based on some confusion of the kind of theory that C.L. Stevenson is presenting. Now, let me back up for a moment. I mean, you make the point that Stevenson wants a moral theory, or Stevenson wants, let's just say let's just say Stevenson wants a theory that allows for moral disagreement. And you think that's a problem because we want our moral theories to give us a way to answer and to solve moral disagreement. But I think that there's a confusion here. You make the point, and I quote Luke, you say people seek a moral theory because the process of determining what the moral act in any given situation is complicated and treacherous. You say, I quote Luke, you say, we look to moral theories not merely to explain what is going on and what the meaning of a statement is, but to help guide our decision-making process to do what is right. Let me just point out, Stevenson is doing what we call meta-ethics, okay? He's not doing normative ethics. And for the rest of this semester, we're going to be doing meta-ethics. And meta-ethics concerns the meaning of moral discourse. It concerns questions of what does it mean to say someone is good, morally good, or someone's morally bad? What does it mean to say that an action is morally right or morally wrong? Meta-ethics also deals with questions about the objectivity of ethics. Are there any objective moral truths, or are all moral claims just the expression of personal taste or preference, or are all moral claims just false? So he's really not doing normative ethics. In normative ethics, we're trying to talk about how someone should live, or in normative ethics, we're giving a theory about what it is in fact right or good to do, or in normative ethics, we might be talking about what the actual criteria of moral goodness are. But those are not Stevenson's concerns. Stevenson's simply trying to give us a theory about what it means to say something like Martin Luther King Jr. was a good man, or what it means to say that, murder is bad. And Stephen wants to give a theory about the meaning of moral assertions that allows for there to be genuine moral disagreements. And I think when Stevenson says that, that's reasonable, right? As you point out, we all know that there are lots of things that people morally disagree about. And so we want a theory about the meaning of moral language that allows for there to be genuine moral disagreements, because Luke, I think both of us believe, and I suspect everyone in the class understands, that there are moral disagreements. And so however we explain the nature of moral discourse, we want that explanation to allow for the existence of those disagreements. And the emotive theory does allow for the existence of those disagreements, right? On Stevenson's view, if I say that euthanasia is wrong, what I mean is something like euthanasia, boo, or down with euthanasia, right? But if Molly Walker thinks that euthanasia is a good thing or that it's right, then what she's really saying on Stevenson's view is up with euthanasia or euthanasia, yay. And right, we have disagreeing attitudes then about euthanasia. And so, on Stevenson's view, we can make sense of there being a moral disagreement between Molly and myself in that situation. So, you need to keep that in mind, Luke. And that's all I have to say about that one. And Luke, I'm glad you brought this up because other students might have been confused about this matter as well. Let's go to Laura Nide. Laura Nide's writes the following, and I'll quote from Laura Nide here. Again, and this is her response to, or the issue she raises regarding Stevenson's theory. Laura Nide writes, let's use an example like murder. It seems that the average person would say murder is bad. Certainly there are probably people in the world who would say murder is good. But any moral theory would be hard-pressed to say that murder is not morally wrong. Murder seems ethically wrong no matter personal preferences. However, according to Stevenson, this is just their personal preferences saying that murder is bad. Stevenson would also say that morality and goodness cannot be determined by survey. Does Stevenson think that conceptually there could be someone who earnestly believes that murder is good and that this would be a moral thing? This problem can also be applied to things that are seemingly completely good. An example can be justice, which Aristotle sees as an important virtue for his version of virtue ethics. Aristotle would say justice is good, and that statement would show his personal preferences, but this would not be a moral truth. Conceptually, there could also be a person who says that justice is bad, but doesn't it seem that justice is still good, and people, like dictators, for example, who think that justice is bad are not good people? Nide concludes, I don't understand how there can be no moral truths in the eyes of C.L. Stevenson. There seems to be a solid set of virtues and actions that are good or bad without personal preferences. Murder is bad. Justice is good. These seem like universal truths, whether or not everyone believes and follows this. And that ends the quote from Nide. Just backing up here, one question Nide presents, she asked, does Stevenson think that conceptually there could be someone who earnestly believes that murder is good and that this would be a moral thing? Here's something I want to say, okay? And maybe there's a little bit of confusion, Laura Nide, with, again, the aims of Stevenson's theory. Keep in mind, Stevenson's just giving us a theory about what it means to say that something is morally good, or for that matter, that something is morally bad. It's a theory about the meaning of moral language. Stevenson's not giving us a theory about what it is right or wrong, in fact, to do. He's not giving us a theory of normative ethics, right? So you ask the question, does Stevenson think that conceptually there could be someone who earnestly believes that murder is good? Yeah, sure. Stevenson thinks that there might be some people that think murder is good. Sure, that's a possibility, a sociopath, for instance. Right? But you say, does Stevenson think it's conceptually there could be someone who earnestly believes that murder is good and that this would be a moral thing? Well, whether somebody's claim that murder is good, whether that's a moral thing, that's going to be contingent upon the speaker's attitudes or the speaker's feelings. At the same time, also, there's not any truth of the matter on Stevenson's view whether murder is a good thing or a bad thing. There's no truth of the matter. There's just people's attitudes towards it. So, for instance, suppose I authentically thought that murder is good, right? And suppose I said murder is good, and I authentically feel that murder is good. Well, on Stevenson's view, all that I'm really saying there is yippee for murder, or please do engage in murder, something like that. But notice, when I say yippee for murder, that's not the sort of thing that can be true, nor is it the sort of thing that can be false, right? I'm just expressing a pro attitude. Or if I say, please engage in murder, that's a request. And a request can't be true. It cannot be false. You see what I'm getting at? And on Stevenson's view, it's conceivable that somebody might think murder is good. But on Stevenson's view, if they think it, or if they say murder is good, all they're really saying is something like, murder, yay, or please do engage in murder, you see. And then towards the end of your writing, Laura, you say, I don't understand how there can be no moral truths in the eyes of Stevenson. Well, in a way, I just addressed it, right? In order for there to be moral truths, then moral beliefs or moral claims would have to be the kind of claims that are capable of being true, right? But on Stevenson's view, moral claims are not even capable of being true, because all that they really amount to are claims like X, yippee, or please do X, right? Right? I mean, if I say X is good, all I'm saying is A, yay. If I say X is good, all I'm saying is please do X. But those are not the right. But those are not the sorts of things that can be true, right? Laura, if I say go open the door, that's not true. It's not false. If I say giving to charity is good, all I'm really saying is something like please give to charity, but that's not true and it's not false. Requests are not true or false. You see what I'm getting at? And so, on Stevenson's view, there can be no moral truths because of what it means to say that something is morally good or morally bad. You see? So that's what I have to say about Nide, about some of the issues that you raise. I'm not saying that I've addressed everything that you've got there in your essay, Nide. Let's move to another one. Let's go to Molly Walker. Molly Walker writes, she writes the following. It is understood that on Stevenson's view, and I'm quoting from Walker here, it is understood that on Stevenson's view, he does not believe that in saying X is good, we are stating facts about the nature of X. By saying X is good, we are just expressing our positive attitudes towards X. Also, on Stevenson's view, an adequate view of the meaning of good must meet the criteria which allows for disagreement. But if saying X is good is simply a matter of expressing my opinion and beliefs, then how can he argue that the statement X is good is not a factual statement? It is factual if it is the truth, and since it is the truth that I believe X to be good, and am expressing my true feelings about X, then therefore X is good must be a fact, at least a fact to myself, end quote. Right? And so, something interesting going on here with Molly Walker's criticism. What do I want to say about this? Let's back up here. Right? Let me remind you guys that C.L. Stevenson, he makes an argument that an adequate theory of the meaning of moral language must allow for disagreements between people, right? Disagreements on moral issues, right? So an adequate theory of moral language must allow there to be a disagreement between people on controversial moral issues like the abortion issue or the euthanasia issue or affirmative action programs or whatever it is. And Molly Walker's suggesting, Molly's trying to suggest, Stevenson's theory does not really allow for moral disagreements, right? But Molly, I think your argument is answerable here. And, I'll go back to what you've got here, Molly. Molly, you say on Stevenson's view, right, an adequate theory of the meaning of moral language must allow for disagreement. And then you say, but if saying X is good is simply a matter of expressing my opinion and beliefs, then how can he argue that the statement is good is not a factual statement, right? And then you go on and you say, let me point out, okay, on Stevenson's view, when I say that euthanasia is good, on Stevenson's view, all I'm saying is one of the following, or maybe both of the following. If I say euthanasia is good, I'm saying something like, euthanasia, yippee. Or I'm saying something like, euthanasia, or I'm saying something like, please approve of euthanasia, which is a request, right? Neither of those expressions, euthanasia, yippee, or please approve of euthanasia, neither of those expressions states fact. One is a request. The other is just an expression of emotion, an expression of a pro attitude. Neither states fact. And so if I say euthanasia is good, and then if you say euthanasia is bad, well, I'm just expressing a pro attitude, and you're expressing a negative attitude, and we have a disagreement in attitude, right? Or if what I'm saying is please approve of euthanasia, and you say, and when you say euthanasia is wrong, what you mean is please do not approve of it, we have a disagreement in our intentions, in our goals, right? I'm trying to persuade you to approve of euthanasia. You're trying to persuade me to disapprove of it. And there is a disagreement there in our goals or attitudes, okay? Right? But if, on the other hand, right, if we're working with a Hobbesian interest theory, on a Hobbesian interest theory, if I, what does it mean to say that euthanasia is good on a Hobbesian interest theory? All that means is I like euthanasia. And if you say euthanasia is wrong on the Hobbesian interest theory, then what you're saying is you don't like it. Well, there's no disagreement between us, because what I'm saying is true, I like it, and what you're saying is true, you don't like it. And then there's no room for genuine disagreement. And so I do think this is how Stevenson will respond to the kind of point you raised there, Molly. Look, I would do more here. Something interesting also came in from Joe Aharoni, but I don't want to eat up too much time responding to things. And Joe, you're probably like, Lamos, he ignored me. But I've read it. What you said was interesting, but I think I should move on to the MacIntyre. And Joe, maybe I'll try to get to you next time. I'm sorry, but let's move on and talk about MacIntyre and the ways in which MacIntyre responds to emotivism in the first two chapters of his very famous book from the early 80s, After Virtue. When I was an undergrad, I was very interested in Alasdair MacIntyre's approach to doing ethics. I was once, believe it or not, I was once young like y'all are, and I did a senior honors research project dealing with MacIntyre's After Virtue. And and since coming to Co, I've sometimes written articles where I talk about MacIntyre's views. But let's plunge in on the After Virtue material. And again, you might want to have your outline up and follow along. I don't know how much I have to add to what I've got here. Talk about MacIntyre chapter 1. MacIntyre says that people engage in moral discourse today, but they do so while ignorant of the fact that the set of background beliefs that A, gave meaning to moral language, and B, allowed for the rational justification of moral beliefs has been lost. Okay? MacIntyre says, he says that he wishes to support this thesis in his book. And again, the thesis is let me back up here. I mean, MacIntyre wants to say that people, right, there are lots of moral debates that go on in society today, right? You have your pro-life advocates, right? You have the right to right, and then you have abortion rights advocates. You have those who believe in gun control, those who don't believe in it, right? And there's these ongoing debates and discussions about what's best for society, or what morally it's right or wrong to do. And MacIntyre thinks um, that that MacIntyre really believes that there was a period of time long ago where there were a bunch of background assumptions at work in moral discourse that gave meaning to our moral claims, and that allowed for the rational justification of moral beliefs. And MacIntyre is very concerned that in the society that we live in today, those background assumptions that allow for justified moral beliefs, those background assumptions have been lost. And so people nowadays, they engage in moral debate without any good way of resolving the debates and disagreements that they're involved in. MacIntyre wants to support this view of ethics in the book After Virtue. In support of his view, he examines present day moral discourse, and he shows that it lacks the tools, it lacks what is necessary for rational justification. And he gives an historical account of how this situation came about. Right? The historical account that he provides tries to reveal that long ago there was a coherent worldview that allowed for the rational justification of moral belief, but that worldview has been lost. And just to let the cat out of the bag, I'll just point out that according to MacIntyre, it's his view that the views of ancient Greek and medieval philosophers, there was a framework for understanding the world and human nature that allowed for rationally justified moral beliefs. And that sort of framework, and it's largely a teleological framework about human nature and the system of nature, and for MacIntyre, Aristotle is very much on his mind. But that sort of understanding of the natural world and human beings has been lost in our thinking, and this has been to the detriment of our attempt to give rationally justified moral beliefs. That is MacIntyre's view. I want to move on now to some issues that come up in Chapter 2, and I have more to say about Chapter 2. Let's talk about moral disagreements in contemporary society. MacIntyre says there's no rational way of securing moral agreement in our contemporary culture. Therefore, moral debates between, say, abortion rights groups and pro-life groups, gun rights advocates and gun control advocates, or euthanasia advocates and euthanasia opponents, right? All of these debates between such groups that goes on without end and without any clear way to resolve the debates between these groups. Right? Each side in these debates can provide logical arguments for their different positions, but the starting points of their arguments, their assumptions, are different. Both sides in the debate may have plausible or reasonable starting points, and there seems to be no way of settling whose starting assumptions are better. Right? So, for instance, right, think about the abortion debate. Right, a lot of times, people who think that abortion is wrong, they start on the assumption that all human beings, even fetal human beings, have a right to life, right? And that this is, one of the most fundamental of human rights, and therefore abortion is wrong since it involves violating the right to life of a fetal human being. In contrast, right, you have different assumptions at work among people who generally you have different assumptions at work among those who believe that abortion is morally acceptable. One of the assumptions is that adult women have rights to do what they want with their own bodies. And then there's also can be an assumption that fetal human beings don't possess the same kinds of rights as adult human beings, right? And the starting assumptions that are worked with in that debate both have some level of plausibility to them, but once you start with those assumptions, you can then justify competing conclusions. There doesn't seem to be any easy way to resolve the debate between the pro-lifers and the pro-choicers on the abortion topic, just for example. Now, despite the fact that there seems to be no way of settling these different fundamental disagreements that we see in our society, our moral language, our moral discourse, and our moral debates are expressed in a language that suggests we have impersonal, objective reasons to back our viewpoints, right? People make their arguments on moral debates as though they are providing objective criteria to support their positions on the issues that they're debating about. There's a certain sort of air of objectivity to our moral debates. But MacIntyre thinks that there doesn't seem any clear way to establish the objective truth of competing moral positions in our society today. Now, MacIntyre goes on to talk about emotivism. MacIntyre actually thinks that given the state of moral debate and the irresolvable nature of moral disagreement in our society today, MacIntyre actually thinks emotivism looks fairly plausible. Like maybe that is it. It looks like that might be a correct view about the nature of morality. MacIntyre says, emotivism is the view that moral assertions don't state fact. Rather, moral assertions just express emotions, or they merely encourage others to agree with our own preferences. So, for instance, if I say abortion is wrong, all this means is something like abortion boo, or please disapprove of abortion, or down with abortion. Notice none of these are fact-stating assertions. MacIntyre believes that the current state of moral discourse in our society is one in which persons start with different but plausible assumptions and argue interminably from their assumptions. Thus, the emotive view has a certain air of plausibility. It looks reasonable. In this climate, it makes sense to believe that morality does not express facts, but is just the expression of emotion. MacIntyre believes that the interminable and unresolvable debates in ethics today are the result of a lost, coherent framework for moral discourse that existed in the past and which has been lost. On his view, moral discourse is not essentially emotive in character, though it appears so in the present age. In contrast, emotivists believe that moral discourse is essentially emotive. It has always been this way and will always be this way. MacIntyre disagrees, and he goes on to make arguments against emotivism, right? So it's important to understand, according to MacIntyre, the emotive theory of the meaning of moral language, it's based on the assumption that morality has always just been the expression of emotion or the expression of requests to approve or disapprove of certain things. And MacIntyre wants to say, well, moral discourse might seem that way today, but MacIntyre wants to say, but morality is not essentially emotive in that way. MacIntyre wants to say that morality can be grounded in facts, and we could do morality in a way such that it is fact stating. And so MacIntyre wants to argue against emotivism. And he walks through three distinct arguments against the emotive theory of discourse. These arguments it seems to me that they occur primarily at pages 12 to 13 of the reading that I gave to you guys. It occurs page 12 to 13 there in chapter 2 of his book, After Virtue. Take a look at a handout. I'm on the second page of the handout. MacIntyre presents the first argument, and it runs something like this. If emotivism is correct, it should be able to clarify the difference between moral approval and other kinds of approval. But emotivism cannot establish the difference between moral approval and other kinds of approval. Therefore, emotivism is false. Let me just point out that first premise. If emotivism is correct, it should be able to clarify the difference between moral approval and other kinds of approval, right? Let me just point out, right? Not all approval is moral approval, right? If I say that Jody is a good basketball player, I'm not making a moral claim. I'm expressing approval of Jody, at least an approval of her qua basketball player. Or if I say that Henry is a good dancer, I'm expressing approval of Henry qua dancer, but that's not the same thing as making a moral assessment, right? And MacIntyre's got this view. You know, MacIntyre, it strikes me, he doesn't really develop this very much, but he says that the emotive theory does not seem to have a way of distinguishing between moral approval and other kinds of approval. And, you know, maybe the idea here is that, you know, maybe what's on MacIntyre's mind here is that if I say that Jody is a good dancer on the emotive theory, that's really just going to amount. I suspect what's on his mind is that on emotive theory, that's just going to amount to a claim like Jody's dancing, yippee. Or if I say Jody's a good dancer, what am I really saying? I'm stating that if I say Jody's dancing is good, I'm saying yippee for Jody's dancing, right? And if that's how we analyze Jody's dancing is good, if that just means yippee for Jody's dancing, well, that's the same analysis as that we're giving for a claim like Jody is morally good. That also just means yippee for Jody. And so there doesn't really seem to be a difference between the analysis of a claim about the goodness of Jody's dancing and the analysis of the goodness of her character. They both amount to yippee for Jody in some way, shape, or form. So maybe MacIntyre's onto something there. Let's look at his second argument. The second argument runs something like this. MacIntyre says, if emotivism is true, then all moral judgments are just expressions of personal preference. That's just seems definitionally correct about emotivism. Point 2. But there's a difference between expressions of personal preference and evaluative judgment. MacIntyre would continue, I only have reason to care for your personal preference due to your position, such as whether you're my boss or my teacher, or your relation to me, such as maybe you're my wife or my mother. But this is not the case with evaluative judgment. Therefore, emotivism is false. Right? So, again, point 1, if emotivism is true, then all moral judgments are just expressions of personal preference. That's just straightforwardly correct about emotivism. And then now let's take a look at the second point. But there's a difference between expressions of personal preference and evaluative judgment. There seems to be something right about that, right? And MacIntyre makes the point that, right, I mean, suppose my boss says good workers show up to meetings on time. And suppose all that really means from the emotive view is, from the emotive perspective, maybe all that means is please show up to work on time. Right? On the emotive view, if my boss says good workers show up to work on time, and on the emotive view, what that really means is, and it's my boss saying it, all that really means is please show up to work on time. Now, if that guy was not my boss, it wouldn't make any difference to me that he's telling me please to show up on work on time. It wouldn't give me any reason to show up to work on time if he's not my boss, you see. Right? But whereas if somebody is making a moral assertion that morally good workers show up to work on time, even if that person's not my boss or not my teacher, if they're making a moral claim that good workers show up to meetings on time, that gives me some reason to take seriously what they're saying, and may give me good reason to change my behavior in such a way that I show up to meetings on time. You see what I'm getting at? And so, right, genuine evaluative assertions and genuine moral evaluative assertions, right, we shouldn't regard those as just the expression of personal preference, because if they're moral evaluative assertions, they should be giving us reason to behave in certain ways that are not contingent on somebody's having a position of power over us, or somebody's being a loved one whom we care about. You see what I'm getting at here? And so for these reasons, I think that MacIntyre, he may well be onto something here that might be a significant problem for emotivism, might be. The third argument that MacIntyre makes against the emotive theory. The third argument, this occurs at page 13 of our text. This goes something like this. If emotivism is true, then moral claims are just expressions of attitude or feeling. This constitutes their meaning. But point 2, the feeling expressed by a sentence is a function of its use, not its meaning. Therefore, emotivism is false. If emotivism is true, the moral claims are just expressions of attitude or feeling. This constitutes their meaning. That just follows straightforwardly from the emotive theory. And then MacIntyre makes this peculiar claim that the feeling expressed by a sentence is a function of its use, not its meaning. I would just point out that MacIntyre gives an example to illustrate point 2 in this third argument. If you look at page 13, MacIntyre used an example from Gilbert Ryle, and this example is intended to show that sort of the feeling expressed by a statement comes from its use, not from its meaning. MacIntyre writes, the angry schoolmaster, to use one of Gilbert Ryle's examples, may vent his feelings by shouting at the small boy who has just made an arithmetical mistake. 7 times 7 equals 49. But the use of this sentence to express feelings or attitudes has nothing whatsoever to do with its meaning, right? 7 times 7 equals 49. That has a certain sort of factual content, that it has a certain sort of factual meaning that's expressed in it. But at the same time, the angry schoolmaster who's irritated with his student, he expresses feeling through the utterance of 7 times 7 equals 49. He expresses the feeling through the way in which he uses this otherwise meaningful statement. And so MacIntyre uses that example to support what we have as a second premise in the third argument. And I don't have more to say about that just now. I want to move on now, talk a little bit about some other things that MacIntyre does in his piece. I've got a point here on the outline. It says on why emotivism has been attractive. As noted above, and despite its flaws, MacIntyre thinks that emotivism has seemed to many people to be correct, and I've touched on that earlier. Again, it seems correct in part because the nature of moral disagreement in society makes it appear correct. We engage in seemingly interminable moral debates on many different issues because we start from initial and plausible assumptions, and we have no way to discern whose starting assumptions are the right ones. Additionally, MacIntyre points out that in the early 20th century, the metaethics of G.E. Moore were popular in philosophy. G.E. Moore held that there were objective moral truths. On his view, true moral assertions expressed which actions, persons, or states of affairs were good or bad, and goodness was understood as a non-natural property which must be intuitively grasped by a person in order to recognize what is good. According to Alasdair MacIntyre, the problem with this is that if moral arguments start with intuitive-based assumptions, there will be no way to resolve disagreement when people have competing intuitions. He believed that this prominent early 20th century approach to understanding the nature of morality expressed in Moore's philosophy, it helped foster the interminable debates we see in ethics today, and which helps to make the emotive theory attractive. But as we've seen, MacIntyre thinks emotivism is mistaken and moral discourse is not inherently emotive. In his book, he goes on to argue that moral debate is not inherently emotive and moral debate need not be interminable, unending. Ultimately, he believes the proper framework for doing ethics is Aristotelian. We need to ground our moral claims in claims about human nature, viewing human life as having certain distinctively human features, in virtue of which assertions about the goodness of human beings and virtue can be given objective foundations. Okay? So, I mean, at a certain level, there is a certain dimension, and if you've done the reading of chapter 2 from Alasdair MacIntyre's After Virtue, it's part of our assigned reading for the day, you will see that MacIntyre, he thinks that one of the things that has made emotivism attractive is the fact that in the early 20th century, G.E. Moore understood goodness as a non-natural property. By non-natural, what Moore was getting at is that he didn't think that you could define goodness in terms of the natural properties of things. And if you cannot define goodness in terms of the natural properties of things, then you might come to the conclusion that goodness is indefinable, and that to know what's good, you just have to somehow intuitively grasp what is good, and maybe intuitively grasp what is bad, right? But if this is how we, right, come to lock on to what's good, and if people have competing intuitions, it doesn't look as though there's going to be any easy way then to resolve disagreements between those with competing intuitions, and then if that's how people conceive of the nature of goodness, well, people with competing intuitions, they may, right. So, I mean, for instance, just look at somebody who's got the intuition. I don't know, think about somebody who's got the intuition that the rightness of actions has to do with their utility maximization, right? On the one hand, think about somebody else who thinks that the right actions have to do with, treating humanity as an end in itself. If those are two different intuitive grasps of the nature of rightness, right, well, this could lead one person For instance, the Kantian, who maybe thinks intuitively it's obvious that we ought always to treat persons and ends, this person may then be led to say that euthanasia is wrong because it treats humanity as a mere means. And yet somebody else who intuitively conceives of right action as utility maximization, well, this person may easily be led to end up arguing that euthanasia is acceptable because in some situations it will be, an instance of utility maximization, reducing the suffering of the person, in significant ways to justify the practice of euthanasia, right? And if people are starting out with those different starting points and which come from different intuitions, there may be no way to resolve the debate between those who think that euthanasia is sometimes acceptable and those who think that it's never acceptable. Now, of course, in the end, G.E. Moore thinks that this intuitionist conception of goodness, which was espoused by G.E. Moore, he thinks it's problematic, and it helped. And again, he thinks it also helped foster the attractiveness of the emotive theory. The emotive theory also might be perceived as attractive just by looking at the interminable natures of some of the moral debates that exist in our society today. But in the end, right, MacIntyre thinks of ethics in more Aristotelian terms, and MacIntyre somehow thinks that facts of human nature can be used, just as Aristotle did. Facts of human nature can be used to ground and justify assertions about human goodness and virtue. And that's where the rest of his book goes in that direction. Right? There's a certain sense in which MacIntyre thinks we can define goodness in terms of natural properties, just looking at the function of a human being, or the nature of human life. Can give us the grounds for objective claims about what it is to be a good human being. And we've seen this sort of stuff when we studied the Aristotelian ethics earlier in the semester. But anyway, that's a bit about MacIntyre. I've always been somewhat sympathetic with his approach to ethics. There's probably some G.E. Moore scholars that might hate the way I've characterized Moore today and might hate the way MacIntyre characterizes Moore. But that's all part of the foray that is ethical theory. I don't have more for you. Next Monday, we will go live on Zoom, and that way we can talk amongst each other. And again, I will want all of you to write something about MacIntyre's ethics for Monday and get that to me by 11 in the morning so I can look at that. And then we'll meet at 2 live on Zoom. We'll talk about MacIntyre, share our thoughts on MacIntyre, but we'll also move on to look at a different kind of meta-ethical view, that of J.L. Mackie. I'll see you guys. Take care. Bye-bye.